Hi, I'm Susan Shachter, was a member of the Philadelphia Encampment Group, and we are now in Germantown at Elliot and Otter's house. And Elliot and Otter were not part of the group. They weren't here at the time, but I know they spent a lot of time at the Peace Camp.
My name is Z, and I was also involved with the group that started initially to organize to bring people from Philadelphia up to the Peace Camp, and then continued as an ongoing local peace activist group. And we actually did have an encampment at our Navy Yard here as well. It's a long time ago. I don't have all that clear memories.
Well, it's also, for me, it was one of the happier times in my life. Yeah, it was really interesting because I think there was a way in which, living in Philadelphia, we ended up doing some really interesting local stuff, but I always felt part of a bigger movement, and I just sort of was a culmination from a period of time of lots of political energy. And I just felt like for a while as a group we were like on fire. We were charged and we did a good job. Many creative things. And sometimes, I long for that period. It's very different.
Yeah.
The world now and maybe my life.
Where did you first hear about the encampment?
Yeah, how did we get together?
Well, it was before email, so it wasn't that we got an email about it.
I guess a number of us must have read about Greenham Common.
Yes, well, and then I'd known people who had been at Greenham Common. And I'm trying to think who I might have known besides you. Well, maybe I knew Melinda, and maybe that's how I heard from Melinda.
Because, she was well connected. Z and I worked together at the time.
And I don't think that I knew Peggy before then, or Alice, or...
No, you and I and Melinda.
Must have been through Melinda, because she had worked at Wilf before I did.
Yeah.
Okay.
And she was, to my knowledge anyway, she was the program director at Wilf at the time, and I think she was part of the group of people that negotiated to find the land and secure it initially in the process. And I think what was wonderful and different about the Peace Camp in New York than any other kinds of peace organizing that I had done was that we were really right there in the belly of the beast. And there was a sense that we would be not only part of something large that was national, but something that, because there were peace camps all around the world. And we were part of literally shutting down the machine. Not that we literally shut down the machine, but we shut down the machine. And it's that in that incarnation, and so there was the sense of immediacy about being right there at the base that is pretty different when you're in a city and like Philadelphia. It's not like being in Groton, Connecticut, or someplace like that, where the targets are more conceptual than actual. So there was something very wonderful about the being right there at the base, and the gathering together of energy of women from every corner of the planet to that place. That was it's sort of like going to the music festival in some senses.
Yes.
And the sort of learning, also like at the festival, sort of learning what it means to build a community around something like that. And there was a lot of learning.
One of the things for me too is that when Vietnam War was happening, my parents were activists of sorts. So I went to some civil rights marches. I went to those marches, but I was like a few years younger than people that were really on the pulse of doing more stuff. So, I always went along, but I didn't completely understand it. It wasn't something that I owned. I sort of was swept along with the movement and felt that the war was wrong. And I think with Seneca, well, first place, probably, I don't know, maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago, I really something really clicked because I started understanding sexism and feminism, and it was all right. This is
You don't mean 5 or 6 years ago.
I mean 5 or 6 years before. Right. I don't mean 5 or 6 years ago. No. And being able to claim something that really felt, it was like in my center. And I started doing things, and I started learning and started absorbing, and I think, you know, being part of a peace encampment was, all right, you know, I've learned a lot, I've grown, I'm finally here, and I'm part of this group. Not that I knew initially that we were going to go on for years or anything like that, but somehow it was claiming something that belonged to me, and and having at that point enough sophistication and savvy to really be there with it, as opposed to sort of Vietnam, where I understood a certain amount, but a lot was still a little unclear to me.
You know, I think actually
In Europe,
probably how I heard about the peace camp was from Sarah Lee.
yeah, that was.
Because she
right.
certainly would have
Yes,
been in the
that's
middle
right.
of it, and it feels very sad and ironic to me as she is in the hospital tonight, close to death anyway, to remember and honor the role that she played in bringing people together around the peace camp through the service committee.
And I don't remember how. I remember flyers going out, but I don't remember who it's. I don't remember who initiated the initial meeting.
I think it was Janet.
She was actually the
Probably
one?
Janet, because it was her church.
Yeah. Oh, it was her.
And then it was Janice and Peggy, probably, who are, you know, working with Melinda and whoever all else. I don't really know. Maybe Peggy knows the answer to that.
And they had been.
Certainly Melinda does. I think the best story about how somebody came to those meetings, though, is the story about Alice.
I don't remember.
Alice, at the time, was she 19?
Yeah, around 19.
She wasn't 20. She might have been younger than that. She might have been 18. And Alice's family also were all activists, and her mother was a peace activist and of her own enormous stature. But she kind of got it about Alice that Alice wanted to be doing something in a group of women before Alice did. And she drove Alice to the meeting and said, "Here, go to this meeting, Alice."
Wow.
Yeah, that was... sometimes your mother's not the last to know.
Uh-huh.
That was, and she was, you know, and she was like the baby.
Well, no, Amy. That was in. That
Well,
was.
but
the
Amy
blind.
came later.
Oh, she came later.
But, you know, and now Alice is a psychologist.
I know.
So time has gone by, but, you know, it was sort of, you know, really a formative experience for her as an adult.
Uh-huh.
So then what happened was that somehow someone heard about this encampment happening in New York, and then
Well,
somehow you all
the
came
Women's
together.
International League and American Friends Service Committee both have their national offices in Philadelphia.
Right.
And those were the two groups that got together to find and initiate the process of setting up the camp. And so they, you know, things were happening there, but they also were wanting people from around the country to get together and get themselves up there and to support the camp and to go up beforehand and help make it happen, etc., etc. So they initiated a group in Philadelphia to be the Women's Peace Encampment Support Group, I guess you would call it. And then after having gone up several years in a row, you know, rented buses and let people know about it and all that kind of stuff, we decided to continue as an ongoing group.
I remember. I'm trying to think. I was thinking of things that came up. I mean, it was really. I remember there were Christian and Jewish stuff that came up a lot. I remember there was people who were doing CD and people who weren't doing CD. This was just, you know, all in preparation for going up. I'm just trying to remember some of the
Dialogues.
Discussion.
The dynamic.
Right.
Dynamics.
Right. The dynamics.
Well, you know, the Christian and Jewish stuff reminds me of one of the very few stories that I really do remember from the first night that we got there. There was a meeting that night to sort of plan what we were going to do when we got to the fence the very first time. And a lot had already been done. And we went to this meeting to hear about what had been planned and to sort of finish things up. And part of the plan, and I don't know how much of this had to do with Sharon Jaffe, probably not all that much of it, but of course, as typical for her, she ended up in the middle of it. that there was some plan to, when we got to the gate, to blow the shofar.
Oh, I
And
remember.
there was somebody there who was dead set against that happening because blowing the shofar was too militaristic.
I don't remember that at all.
And honestly, we were up all night talking about everything that you can imagine would be involved in that dispute. It was very interesting. And honestly, I was so far at the back of the line, I don't know if they blew the shofar or not. But I remember looking at this woman, I was like, my God, where are you coming from? And then spending all night finding out where she was coming from.
So, had you all been doing consensus in the groups that you were in?
Yeah.
So consensus wasn't something that was new to you.
It was sort of new to me. I mean, I kind of understood it to some extent, but but I don't know that I'd been part of a group that, as long as I was part of the encampment group, where we really maintained consensus. To the degree that we did. I mean, I always said my attention span's an hour and a half, and I will agree to absolutely anything after an hour and a half, so, but that's real for me, but, so yes.
Like a lot of groups, there was a lot of consensus by exhaustion, but I
Yeah.
think that's just true,
Yeah, it's a
part of
reality.
human nature.
And that, and part of, but, yeah, that was another thing I remember. I was just going to say they came up with the Jewish-Christian story. When we would start to really get into things and it would get intense, a lot of the times, and I mean, I don't know if it's all Jewish and Christian, but as a Jew, I mean, I argued, I talked things out, and I remember there was a little block, and actually they'd been part of a sort of like a Christian peace community, this little block, and I think when things got really agitated, they would want a moment of silence. And do you remember that? So we would struggle. Well, we were in the middle of it. We don't want a moment of silence. But we need a moment of silence to, kind of center ourselves and, just get things. And I don't even know how we ever resolved that. I can't remember, but that was something
I
that,
don't remember very many moments of silence.
No.
I mean, maybe the first year.
the first year.
When we
And
were
after
meeting
that,
at
yeah.
What was that church called? Tabernacle?
Tabernacle.
Yeah.
The,
Oddly enough, when we moved to the Friends Service Committee, we didn't have any moments of silence.
yeah, that was sort of the first year. And, and it would be interesting to know how everybody ultimately felt about that. I mean, a couple of people finally moved. I mean, things really changed. How long was it before we actually got it together to get up to Seneca for the first time?
Maybe 5-6 months.
5 or 6 months.
I mean, we started in the middle of the year, and it was happening in the summer.
What was it like when you first got there?
We had heard Z's best friend Sharon had said, was the reality changed every
When we
60
got there,
seconds? Yes.
she had come. She'd been at Greenham for a long time, and she had gotten to the peace camp. She had lived in Philadelphia and had moved to Minneapolis. She'd gotten to the peace camp a good bit before we had. And one of the things that her job was to do orientations for newly arriving groups. And so when we arrived, it was Sharon's job to orient. She says, well, the first thing you need to know about the peace camp is that reality changes every 5 minutes. And indeed, that's true. And wiser words were hardly ever spoken, not only about the peace camp, but about many other things as well. But it did set the tone, it's sort of like that it was going to be full of surprises. I think I was a little surprised at how much conflict there was.
And within the group, in the peace camp or the outside of the peace camp?
With the peace camp.
Yeah.
Within the women who were setting it up. At least at minimum I was surprised at how open people were about it. You never know about conflict that nobody's telling you about, but everybody, it was an article of faith that you would always be open about what was happening, and it's very difficult to have consensus with an ever-shifting group. That's just consensus is hard enough, and then to have consensus with new people every time you have a meeting is really a very, very tall order. Because you have to go back and reconsent to everything every time you start. But it seemed like by the time we had gotten there was already some pretty bad feelings.
Do you remember any specifics or issues
I'm
or
trying
what
to
realm we're
remember
talking?
what in particular.
It's okay if you don't.
My guess is it was always about food, cleanliness, and money. Those are usually the issues that people fight about. And I don't know, Estelle, what do you think?
Dishes. Who does the dishes? That the revolution is based on dirty dishes.
Right.
Okay, so food, money, and
clean.
and cleanliness. Right. And yeah.
That's usually what people...
Right.
It doesn't come down to high lofty principles of violence or non-violence. It usually comes down to those things.
To the basics.
Do you remember other things that like impressed or?
I felt
feelings
like
of-
people had handled the conflict with folks in town pretty well. I was pretty impressed with that. I thought it was pretty maturely done. And I know it wasn't ever really completely resolved, but I thought that people had done a really put in a good faith effort and worked pretty hard at it and thought pretty well about that. It wouldn't have been hard for me to imagine it going much worse. And that reminds me of the other story that I was trying to remember when I came up here about the nuns. Do you remember the nuns that first day?
Yes, I vaguely.
There had been a lot of guys from town, maybe they were drunk, maybe they weren't, coming and shouting all kinds of nasty, horrible things, and getting the witches and the commies and the dykes and the whatever. And people were worried when everyone went off the land to go to the base that somebody might come and vandalize and there had been some vandalism earlier before then, if I'm not mistaken. And a group of nuns came. The story that I heard was that they were from like Buffalo or Rochester, in full nunly regalia, with the long habits and the combat boots and the crosses this big and the hoods out the end, and tromped around the edges of the land patrolling it, and the guys would come by and they'd be shouting out these horrible things. It was
There was a line of nuns right there.
They were just traumatized, and it really did, I think, keep them away for a long, long time. And it really gave me a very warm spot in my heart for some of those most traditional nuns who knew the power of their habit and were willing to use their power for the peace camp. And I always thought that was really a wonderful and remarkable story.
Yeah, but
They didn't want to think that the women on the land were people who were like anybody that they knew. They wanted, that in their mind these were aliens, and who are the aliens that we're afraid of? They're communists and lesbians and witches and all those things that we were. But I think that that made them afraid, and it also gave them permission to behave badly.
You always have to see somebody as the other to behave badly. I mean, you have to dehumanize them. Well, one of the things I was going to say about that is that, I think that people who were really engaged over time, who were at Seneca for a while, engaged in real dialogue with townspeople. I think it's such a transformational experience for everybody because, after a while, it seemed like some of the women that talked about actually being able to reach and make a connection with the townspeople also had to, allow themselves to see those people who were, cursing and throwing things as human beings. And just like the townspeople had to begin to see these lesbians and, everything that was negative to them as human beings. And I think that, that's a very rare experience for most of us where, there's somebody that represents all the things that either we fear, don't like, don't agree with, to be able to find those moments of humanity, and we might never have, encountered them again and ever had reason to have that kind of dialogue. And one of the things that I remember, and this isn't a creative action, but I do know that, remember one of the women in our group had talked to one of the guards at the facility, and they got into a real dialogue, and, she said that he started to cry because he was really, really moved. And, he for a while he had said that he was shut down, but then eventually he began to take in what our message was and started to really feel conflict about doing what he was doing. And and it didn't mean he was going to quit, because he had a family, he needed to make a living, but nonetheless he was questioning what he was doing, and it did, he really went deep into himself and his conscience, and I remember being extremely moved by that.
I remember a number of flirtations between some of the women there and some of the soldiers that went on for a week or two. I always thought that was quite extraordinary. Because a lot of the actions were very playful and very funny, and those guys were, they had a sense of humor too, I think one of the things that also struck me when we got to the camp, I remember really enjoying the singing and the music, and the some of the songs that came out of the peace camp are still very important and are part of my life still today. Well, like Shameless Hustle.
Shameless Hustle, and we don't give a damn.
That's a, that's a classic.
Yeah. Black Socks. This was an Alice
I don't
one.
think that I thought the peace camp. I think it's just an Alice song.
But didn't we all start singing it then? That was.
Well, yeah. Whenever we were around Alice, we sang that. But I don't think that wasn't, But I still have the peace camp songbook. And the one by the Waters of Babylon.
Yeah.
That day I remember we were fairly close to the back of the line, and what's her name? Annie Patterson, the woman who later did Rise Up Singing, was with us, and she just knew, between she and Alice, they just knew every song that you could imagine, and had a wonderful voice, and we just stood there and sang for hours and hours. It was really wonderful. Unlike when we were on the steps of the Supreme Court when we did the Hokey Pokey, but the other thing that was very interesting to me, and that I spent a lot of time thinking about, not only when I was there, but in between and when I went back, thinking about the difference between the peace camps in Europe and in other places, and the peace camp, and it isn't the only one in the U.S. where we had to go and buy land and have a house, and we didn't live in benders and camp out on the common. Not that we had a common, but there was something very different and very American and very materialist, and I don't know, something very frontierish about it, that we had to buy a house in order to have a peace camp, and it just really sort of struck me, the contrast, and I thought about that for years and years and years, and sort of like, what does that mean about our activism?
What did you come up with?
I probably came up with 1,000 different answers. I haven't thought about it in a long time, but now that I'm talking about it, I remember that being one of the things that really kind of obsessed me about it. That it's like, we have a peace camp, we have to go buy a house. We're Americans.
Interesting.
Did you have that consciousness when you were there, or it was afterwards that you came
When I was, I remember, because I knew the people who were involved in buying it, and we were constantly being asked to raise money to buy it, and we raised a lot of money and gave a lot of money, and believe me, I didn't have any money then. I gave a lot of money that I didn't have.
Well, I just also remember, and again, my experience was not extensive in doing things like this, and I remember just like really trying to figure out what was happening. Even who was here for the weekend, who was here for the week, who lived in the house. There was this meeting with this and this meeting with that, and where do I go? And it's all so interesting. So for me, it was like, oh my God, this is amazing. This is overwhelming. But the second,
so young.
what? We were so young.
How old were you each?
I don't know, what year was it?
Mid-20s.
83.
I was probably mid-20s, and you were?
83, so I was 32.
55, 60.
32?
Right, and I was 28 then. Well, the story that I have to tell, I will obviously never forget this. I grew up in suburban New York, and I made friends with the girl who had moved from Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, and I was absolutely thrilled, because everybody basically came somewhere from New York. And I've never met anybody from Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. And I thought it was incredible because instead of saying bag, she said sack and all of this kinds of stuff. And they had moved, her father worked for a company. They had moved to California when I was about 17. I guess they had moved in when I was 12 or 13 into the New York area. And I hadn't seen Marge in years and years and years. And one of the things I remember about Marge is she always wore a ton of lipstick, but she never got the lipstick on quite right. So it was sort of always off of her lips and very bright. And I always used to laugh about it. And I remember the wood planks. And I also remember having this feeling of not chemically induced, of like, I remember the planks, and I always remember feeling as though I was buoyant on them. Rather than walking, I was buoyant. Everything sort of had this buoyant, floaty feel. It was sunny, and from a distance, I look, and I see a pair of red lips. And my heart, absolutely, it's going thump, 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 thump. We get closer, and I said, oh my God, it's her. And I said, Marge, do you remember me? And, and we started talking. Oh, and my God, she had been a psychic and into doing seances. She was in some ways, such a traditional person, and in some ways, such an unconventional person. And to see her there, and to see that this is something she was doing with her life. And she'd been such a housewife, and it just absolutely blew my mind. Blew my mind. And so when you want to talk about different cross sections of women, it was somebody who had just started to get involved with anti-nuke stuff and, really got into it fully. And she said, I have never been to, an all-female gathering like this, but she was loving it. I was loving it. I hadn't seen her in years. We came from two completely different parts, and I don't mean physically different parts, but different worlds. And to think that she would be the person that I would run into. And after that, I was so high and so excited. I was like an Energizer bunny running around. And then Z's girlfriend, Kathleen, wanted to kill me because I forgot the tent poles, which isn't like a whole lot about Seneca. Do you remember that?
I remember that.
Do you remember? She was fuming. And I'm looking around.
You were talking earlier about songs.
It really brought us together. I'm a great fan of Sweet Honey and the Rock, and Cy Barnwell always talks about, how it's hard to have a movement without singing, and it doesn't happen a lot in my experience in a lot of modern movements, but the Peace Camp, really a lot of the blood that circulated through us was the music.
Yeah.
It was important.
And I remember too weaving the web, and I remember also that was a big whether it was done through dance or through yarn, and I remember that happening at the gate before people got arrested, and that was a concept that came from from Seneca for me, that I still think about and take with me. And it's also, right now I work in an office with two young women who are 26 years old, and I feel like I'm almost on a different planet in some ways, because I did have so much experience with collective, with consensus, with coming together to make decisions and doing things. And it's so, and I don't know if this is just a different generation or if there are lots of younger people doing the same thing, but these people I'm working with are just not like that. But nothing is done collectively. There's no sense of coming together and talking about things and working it out and making decisions and recognizing that maybe this person is good at this and this person's good at that, and you come together and then you can really be strong and do something. And to me, having been part of that, and, Seneca in a way was one of the first places, where I really got to have a sense of that, and I just feel in a lot of ways so honored, because it just feels to me like the way to live, and, the way to I don't know, it just seems like it's filled with a lot more humanity to me. And it feels like it's one of the only ways when you have that kind of a commitment that, we can learn as people to be different and to survive.
Yeah.
Now, one of my favorite stories about the peace camp has nothing to do with the politics of it at all, but of the land itself that had been in corn, and nothing had been done to reclaim the land, to plow it or level it or anything, and so there were these huge humps of caliche, and kind of like somebody had taken a hokusai picture of waves and froze it. And Susan and I went up the first year. We're tenting together, and it had occurred to me, I don't know how many years later, that if we had just turned the tent around, or even just turned our bags around, it wouldn't have been quite so bad. But we lay down, and we're lying on something that's going like this, and we lay down, and we just started to laugh hysterically. It was unbelievable. It's like, what are we lying on?
It was so incredibly uncomfortable. All you could do was laugh.
And we knew there was going to be no sleeping happening.
Yeah, that was it. It
None
was done.
whatsoever.
Yeah.
So we spent the night. I spent the night trying to teach Susan how to whisper.
That's right.
Which is more than the work of one night, I assure you. But we knew it would keep us busy. And we didn't even make any pretense of sleeping. It was very funny.
Fun.
But I'll never remember, being tired and cold and happy to get in my sleeping bag and lying down. What is this? It's like, what? And if we had just turned around, we could have slept in between them. But it was just, I don't know, maybe it wasn't true. Maybe they were not frozen, but furrows. But I don't know, I just remember. So when I went back the next year, we didn't even camp on the land. We went down the road to the state park, which was lovely. It was beautiful, grassy.
Right.
Although we did put our tent up underneath an oak tree, and there was a squirrel in that oak tree who took great exception to the fact that we were on his land and spent the whole night lobbing acorns at us. But it was much more comfortable than sleeping on the caliche.
And I remember the civil disobedience and trying to figure out, what was going to happen to the women.
Oh, the ban and bar letters, yes.
And was civil disobedience something that either of you had been a part of before that?
You had.
I had. And you? No. Was that the first time? Did you go over the fence?
No.
Did you take any training?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And then, I took training in terms of, because I was trying to figure out if I wanted to do it, so I took training in what civil disobedience was like. And then, I think I was part of some of the planning meetings for it. And then, in terms of being support, we had our own meetings.
Affinity group. And,
Right.
And in the end, you decided not to do it?
I didn't do it then. I ended up, the first time I did it was in the South African Embassy in Washington. Did you do it?
I did.
Yeah.
Do you remember anything about it?
Well, I'd never heard of a ban and bar letter before, so that was new. There really didn't seem very much like an arrest. It was all sort of pretty. It felt sort of like make-believe arrest, sort of. When you've been in the roundhouse in a big city, or in the holding tank in Washington, and it felt pretty different. It was sort of like getting arrested at the Nevada test site, where they put you on a tennis court and stood up and said, "All right, you're now all under arrest. Raise your right hand if you're under arrest." At the test site, they have a traffic sign that says "Slow down, protester crossing." But so it was kind of like on that spectrum more. I didn't take it very seriously. Well, I didn't think I'd be back there except to get arrested anyway, so it didn't really matter.
Was that in '83, the first time you got arrested? Was it during the first
action, the opening night, opening day, I guess. And I remember puppets. I remember the big puppets from Vermont, big faces.
Bread and puppet.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was astounding to me.
And all the things on the fences that were beautiful. It was pretty nice.
So
and this.
Yeah.
And Alice still has her necklace with the hands like this.
Do you remember the thing we did too? Not remember we as a group. This was our little group that we got together and said nothing can be finer than to be. And
No, that was just you and Mass.
no, everyone did it. Yes, because they did their feet. Woo! Got in a circle. Nothing can be finer than to be. And
I missed that one.
Woo!
I missed that one.
Alice really. Oh, Alice. I think it
was.
was. Alice really got into it.
Oh, that's good. Well, I can see how else
Yeah.
you get it.
This was done in public?
On the camp.
In
The camp, yeah. I don't know how we came up with it, but for the couple of mornings we were there, we did.
Mass used to sing that to you in the morning.
Did she?
Yes.
Was she there then?
No.
No, she didn't come to the
No,
camp.
she didn't come to the camp. But that was Mass's song.
Yeah.
Did you then organize a peace camp in Philly?
We did. There's the Navy Yard, which is now they actually did convert. Not that we can take credit for it, but it was still an actual Navy Yard at that time, and we were there, I don't know, 2 or 3 weekends in a row with information about how to convert the Navy Yard into a productive commercial uses. And I think we talked a lot. There was also was a group called Jobs with Peace that was in town, and had done some work about converting the Navy Yard into a trolley production facility, because the last trolley production facility in the United States was the Bud Company here in Philadelphia, and they had just closed. And at the very same time, Philadelphia was actually buying a lot of trolleys from Japan. So somebody had done a very technical study about what you could do to convert the Navy Yard into various productive commercial endeavors. And we were out there. We didn't stay there like a month, or we were there all weekends. We were like, I think it was like 2 or 3
weekends
that we were there, and we did a lot of work in the and inviting people out there, and now it's a shipyard.
And that was on the heels of Seneca that first summer or second
No,
summer?
it was
or
probably later? I don't know, the third year?
Second or third year.
I mean, we had, after the second year, we started going up to the camp.
Okay.
I don't think they were sort of those major mobilizations kind of thing. People went up individually here and there. But we started to do work mostly locally.
A lot of work locally.
Yeah.
And when you speak about as a group going to the camp, how many folks are we talking about?
Going up to Seneca?
just-
Well, we had a whole bus the first year.
The first year was large.
That was like 50.
Yeah.
Wow.
Second time it was smaller. There were some carloads going up.
And then when you moved to more local here, what size group was that, would you say?
I don't know. I mean, there was
varied
a
over
core
years.
of maybe 12, and maybe the larger reach of 20 maybe at most. And then it, over the years it got smaller and smaller. But it really sort of was the core of a friendship network that still exists today.
Right. Absolutely. And I also think that there were times when we did work in coalition with other groups, although it can be very difficult to do because we all had, kind of different ideas about organizing. But we did some pretty incredible things. There was what do we call the tray action? Where what do we?
The waitress action.
Yeah,
In fact, I've been talking to people at Code Pink about doing.
I'd love to do something.
We got these little what looked like waitress trays that, and there's a in-city mall with food court tables, and we took these trays and we glued little soldiers and tanks and stuff on them in little war scenarios, and we went up to people and we said,
here's your order.
Did you buy this? And they would say no. I said, well, you paid for it.
Yeah.
And we had a leaflet that looked like a menu and a check, and we gave that out. The South African African passbook thing, and
we were on the streets and we literally did enactions of what we understood to the degree that we did what it must be like to be in South Africa. And we go up to people and say,
walking down a major street, we would give them all a passbook, that you can't walk down the street without a passbook. And then the other side of the block, we would ask them to show us the passbook, and we did a lot of those, a lot of South African stuff. And International Women's Day, we had those. Remember those big signs of all the women of South Africa?
Yes.
That we were
Oh
wearing?
my God! Beautiful, beautiful.
One of the ones actually, what's his name? The guy who wrote the song, Charlie King, wrote a song about an action that we did. It was the anniversary of the Mennonite settlement in Pennsylvania. I guess it was the
I don't remember.
200th or 300th, I don't remember exactly, but it was a big centennial. And the chancellor from Germany was coming here to meet with the president about had to do with the deployment of the cruise missiles in Germany, and it was very utterly, horrifically ironic because the Mennonites had come here as a peace witness, and we were very, very offended that they were using this opportunity to celebrate the deployment of the cruise missiles. And there was a hotel where they were going to be meeting that had this very tall atrium, and a number of women got dressed up in lederhosen, as I recall, and went in with a big bunch of helium balloons, and they had banners that they could unfurl from that were lit up with the balloons, and then everyone had these big black robes and had this wailing and keening circle in the middle of all of this. So they had gotten in as though they were part of the celebration, and then turned it into a kind of protest.
And we had a ball because these were women who would not get dressed up, and they went to thrift stores, and bought all sorts of outfits. And
German Oompa outfits.
And we really had to figure out, we had to stake out the place, figure out where, how we would get in, how other people were getting in, try to figure out what was happening when, so we could actually get the banners unfurled before everybody was dragged out. It took a lot of planning.
And actually they couldn't, they had no way to get the balloons down. They were up for days and days and days afterwards.
And when we got into that hotel, it was the absolute last thing that they expected. So there was that sense of excitement for having really, in a way, foiled.
It was very interesting because and this was sort of part of what you talked about there being some tension about doing coalition work, that we were seen as the radical loose cannons of the peace movement in Philadelphia in a lot of ways, and the sort of more mainstream peace groups had decided to have a big public rally demonstration, but they weren't going to do it right at the hotel. They did it a ways away at the art museum, and they were very angry at us for insisting that we had to be right there at the hotel. So everyone was looking at them when we snuck in. And Charlie King wrote a song about that because one of the women in the action, Selma Stout, was a friend of his, and he wrote a song. And Donna was part of that action also. Donna
was there too. Another one, when we talk about the nuns, this is always one of my favorites.
I don't think was that the Encampment group, or was that the...
I was an incarnation.
I don't know, they all kind of drifted into
that. It was a lot of the same people with a few, people got involved. But every Christmas, we would go, there's a gallery, which is a downtown shopping mall. We would get dressed up as nuns, and we called ourselves the Sisters of
Responsibility.
Perpetual Responsibility, if I recall. And what we would do is we would wrap condoms.
Wrap them up in Christmas paper with instructions, and then we'd had a little card on the outside. It looked like a holiday card.
Right. And it said
and the odd thing was that even after and they looked kind of like mints or something, and even after we'd given them to them, they would still believe that we were nuns. It was
amazing.
Weird.
They'd open it and they'd find the condom. Somebody believed it. One of the guys gave me a watch. I was buying a watch for somebody. He gave it to me for half price because he said, "Oh, for you, sister, half price." I was stunned. I said, "I just have to dress like." But you know what it taught me? It taught me really the power of religion and the power that was just by faking it. I got this thing half price.
You know what else? Other peace camp action that I really liked was remember the war exercises? You said pump iron, not lead.
Yes,
I loved that one. Yes. And they were having war games. I remember, and we were just it's like war's not a game, and so we marched around as a troop of bodybuilders, and we had fake doorbells and stuff. And then remember when Bevilacqua came to Philadelphia, and we had the fake foot washing?
Yes.
We sort of took peace to be something that could be interpreted very broadly, and pretty much did what we felt like we wanted to do. But I always remember when there was one woman who came to the group who had been working on Off Our Backs and had moved from Washington, and when Karen and Denise came, and they came to some of the meetings of the group, but then there was like this gauntlet laid down. It's sort of like, well, it's too bad you call yourself a peace group, then you can't do all these feminist things. And it just sort of like, to this day I remember that meeting, and it's like, what kind of smacked ass thing is that to say, and it was like, but I think that we took that as a challenge to apply ourselves to broader and broader issues, and did, really, we're sort of like an affinity group that had grown out of the peace camp that addressed whatever issue it was that we felt is important. And the sort of the sense about the process that we had learned, in working towards the peace camp and being at the peace camp and seeing how actions were generated there, was a model that we worked from and evolved, but worked from as a base. And I think it was pretty extraordinary.
Yeah.
Pretty good run that we had.
Do you think that we would have the same freedom today to do the kinds of things that we did then?
I don't think it's that we wouldn't have the freedom to do it so much as the times have changed so much that it would not seem relevant. I mean, we could get press. Every time we did one of these things, we would get press coverage. People would hear about it. They'd hear about it in advance. They'd hear about it afterwards. There'd be pictures in the paper, like the statue gagging.
Yes, that was great.
When they passed the gag rule. Try and get press for something like that today, And I think that also there's a lot less understanding and support for work that's done out of a place of it coming from women.
Yeah.
And it coming from feminism. That I think that there's a lot less. I mean, when we would do things like that, people would say, yes, of course, we understand that, feminist critique of militarism, of course, and I don't think you get that kind of recognition these days.
No, in some ways I think it's sort of gone. I mean, again, when I look at some of the younger people, I just feel it's really gone backwards. And I mean, there are certain things, like certainly, equal pay for equal. I mean, there are certain concepts that I see women really holding on to, but in terms of really going deep down, well, I'm in touch with younger activists who, and I wouldn't say it's gone backwards. I'd say that it has gone forward in its own direction, which is different. Not necessarily one that makes the most sense to me, but it's not, it's not my future. I've lived long enough to see my answers, my solutions become problems. I think about some of the younger women who, involved with thinking a lot about trans stuff, and it's like, well, gee whiz, I'm used to thinking of testosterone as the problem, not the solution. It's I look at these women and think, what are you thinking? But I think that things go, and that there's pendulum swings, and in fact, I really kind of think I'm beginning to see things kind of swing in a different direction already. You just kind of have to live long enough, and you see everything come around again.
Yeah.
Not that there aren't other young feminists, but it used to be that even if somebody wasn't quote unquote a feminist, they had heard about feminists. They they had some understanding, and it seemed to be. It seemed to be a force, and maybe I should say in more conventional circles now, it's really put down, and it doesn't feel like it has that force, and that's different than being in with young activists, because
I one of the coordinators of Code Pink in Philadelphia. And we have the Grannies for Peace that were just committed civil disobedience trying to enlist in the Marines. Between the
Makes
ages of
absolute
73
sense
to
to
90,
me.
right? Well, I said, well, it's sort of
send
like,
folks with experience.
except for the following orders part, some of these women would make pretty good Marines. They're pretty good battle axes, these women. But I don't see them following orders a lot. I live in West Philadelphia where there's a significant anarchist community, and we don't have women's bookstores, but we have anarchist bookstores now, and there are all these coffee shops, and I look at people and I say, these are the people who are the heirs, who are my heirs, who are taking the space that I was in when I was at that age, and I
doing it somewhat differently, but nonetheless they're there.
Well, if they did it the same way, we'd really be in trouble. Things have to evolve, or they're dead. It doesn't mean I have to like it, but I do know that. Nobody has the absolute line on truth nailed down, and I certainly don't. So, it's each facet has something to contribute to making the world a better place, and I try and, when I see somebody who is really genuinely very radical and very political and very dedicated, I look and see what is it that they're contributing. And I think that a lot of the kinds of things that we do in Code Pink are not so terribly different.
No, not in Code Pink. Not in Code Pink.
In fact, what you were saying before about how one person has an idea and another person doesn't, and I've noticed that the Code Pink group in Pittsburgh had this idea about price tags.
Yeah,
and women don't buy the war, and we heard about it and sort of elaborated on it a little bit, and we do that a lot. Those bright pink price tags, and we go into stores and hang them up on the hangers and put them inside of the pockets of things, and what we did is we figured out how much of the cost of the war was borne by folks in Philadelphia, and we figured it out, total and by year and by month and by week and by day and by hour, how much it costs Philadelphians to support the war, and compared that to the city budget and needs for
school education
things that are needed in the city. And would you buy 3 weeks of the war, or would you buy conflict resolution and nonviolent peer training for every high school student in the city for an entire year in a city that has had more than one homicide a day this year? Which would you rather buy? We have 8 of those. And it's interesting because it started in Pittsburgh and it's here, and Cindy's daughter is taking it to Maryland, and I think we're going to see a lot of this. Well, one of the things that it isn't so much about not having the freedom to do some of this, is just not having the cultural underpinnings that when people were setting up the peace camp and having actions at the peace camp and running the peace camp, there was this sense that people would form some kind of common group and take responsibility for things and make them happen. And I think that idea is so much gone from our culture. That, when people want to get involved in something, they go to some agency and volunteer, and there's a staff person that tells them what to do, and they do it for a few hours and they leave. And the idea that you can take on the responsibility for the entire project as a volunteer and pay for it out of your own pocket,
and create something that's uniquely yours,
is not so available as a cultural meme anymore. And so it's very difficult when it's sort of like, oh, well, who's going to do this? Where's the staff person? We have to become a 501c3 and raise money, and it's like, how much money does it take to find somebody who works in a place where they can rip off some copying and
well, and the fun thing about the media too, I remember they always wanted, well, where's first it would be the spokesman.
Who's in charge?
Who's in charge, and where's the spokesman? Do you see men here? And then we'd say, we're all in charge, and just watching them get befuddled because they wanted to know who it was.
Yeah.
The last time we did that, we told them that her 16-year-old daughter was in charge.
That's right.
And you talk to her.
That's right. They're trying to figure it out.
So the idea of nobody in charge, you guys
Have
worked
carried.
with that as part of the group.
Absolutely.
I don't think it's always so true, but
No.
but I think
Wait, say more.
well.
Some
I mean,
people-
in this instance, when we said, "Oh, Johanna's in charge," is a group that I was hoping to get started. And when I said I want this group to exist, and I'm willing to carry the water for the first year. It's pretty clear to me that as far as Code Pink is, it's not like I'm the czar, but if I make something, it gets made. If I don't make it, it doesn't get made. It's like people are sort of more in that mold that I talk about. Like it's like, come and somebody will tell me what to do. Somebody will give me what I need, and I'll do it. And I mean, we're working very hard at changing that. But the idea that somebody is in charge, and then there are everybody else's, lining up behind them, is not necessarily a very good model. And while our structures, we don't like, I'm not like the president of Code Pink or whatever. We are structurally a collective. Roles are not necessarily living up to that.
Except,
It's a goal to be reached, I think.
but I also, I mean, I think that's true and not true. I mean, I think there are certain ways in which there are people that have skills or comfort levels in different things. Like, I mean, I think it always really fell out to a few people who spoke to the media, for instance, when we were doing, because they were, I mean, you did it, Kathleen did it, I mean, because you were articulate, you were very comfortable in that verbal realm with the media. But, if it came to some kind of project that involved, art, then maybe Alice actually took over. So I think it depends somewhat on what we're
Susan,
talking.
your role was always to be reality checked. Well,
Yeah.
do we really have enough time and energy to do this? That was a very valuable thing. That's every time we were planning something, Susan would ask that question.
And to be impulsive, I was always.
It was very important that
Yeah.
you would do that.
Good to go with your strengths.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. And so, I mean, I think that in that way, when you have the concept, at least it does shift. Whereas if you really have if you have a collective concept, at least there's the room to shift. When you have the president, there's no room to shift. And that's the good thing about collectives, because I do think in natural cycles, there are people at certain times who may be starting or putting more energy in or being good at one thing or another, where there are going to be people that at least are maybe quote unquote more in charge, but there's room for that to change.
I mean, it is sort of amazing that things went as well as they did, given how everything had to be a consensus decision, and and then it had to happen again and again and again and again and again with different people, and yet look what happened.
It's quite a miracle.
It really was. But I'm sure that was true at the camp also, that the people who had been there the longest, although they weren't officers in the way that people, happens now, but I mean, clearly information is a form of power, and the people who'd been there the longest and knew the most had a lot of influence.
I mean, I remember.
And that's not bad. I mean, if we don't learn and, use the information that we have, then we're really, really, really screwed,
I mean, I think the important thing to remember, or that I would have to remind myself, is that there were obviously, like you would, there were a core of people who were living there that were really more on top of things, who knew what was going on, who were committed. It was their passion. They were there for, and it makes absolute sense that you're going to know that they'd know more, there'd be more information, they might be better at making certain kinds of decisions, they know the town people, they know this, but that even though there's a core, what made it so powerful is that there were other people that came in and out, and that, that if the power wasn't dispersed and to some extent to be able to move and include a lot of other people coming and going, it would never have been the movement that it had been.
That it was structured in a way that people coming could find a place and a voice. And that's very important.
Or learn. You know, and sometimes, I mean, I know the first, like I said, I was completely overwhelmed the first time I was there, but that didn't mean I didn't take a lot in, and that over a period of time I didn't think about it, process it, and then use it. You know, and I just think for many of us, it was being there was a profound experience. However it hit us, however that was defined for each of us. You know, and it's something that in some way we carry with us.
Yeah.
I mean, it made me very proud. I mean, I did have my stuff, and then, oh yes, we have to buy this cows and land, but it still made me very proud to know that women had done this. And that we could support a group of women who would dedicate themselves to confronting the base, and that I felt like the women who were there all the time were doing it for me, and they were doing it in my name, and that made it easier for me to live on the planet. You know, to sort of know that while this stuff was going on, and I was doing what I was doing here, and then that there were people who were there doing it right there at the base, and I felt like for me, and that was really important.
At what point did the peace camp cease to exist, sort of in consciousness for either or both of you? You were there in '83, and then you went back in '84?
I think I was there in '84. I maybe went through in '85.
And what point did it sort of fall off the map of consciousness?
Well, it sort of did and it didn't, because we were continuing as a group about, it's sort of carrying out the mission of the peace camp at home, so that we were always thinking about it. But just when it sort of really had started to really fall off the map, that Honor and Elliot arrived, and who had a newer relationship with the peace camp that brought it back, although I think I was a little cranky about it by the time you came around.
I was pretty cranky too.
Give it cranky about what?
Well, I guess I felt like there were continuous appeals for money, and is that really where I wanted to put my money at that point? And was what purpose did it really serve if there were a group of women living in the house and there wasn't sort of an extended community, and would would energy, money be better put in other places? I mean, that's sort of, and I don't know that I knew the answer, but I did start to really question.
I mean, there had been a lot of talk that the land would be given back to Native Americans when the camp was closed, and I had said that they didn't want it. So it was very hard to give something back to somebody who didn't want it.
At the time that was explored, they were the Seneca were in the middle of their own pursuing another claim with the state of New York, and they felt at the time that being gifted with a piece of land would interfere with that.
The Cayuga.
I'm sorry, the Cayuga, I want to say.
Yeah.
But that's why at the time that came to a head.
Yeah.
Right.
Anyway, sorry. Just one piece thrown in.
And then there was all the stuff about zapping, and there was a lot of question about whether women should continue to stay there if it was such a danger to them to be there.
Right.
I mean, I think it got harder and harder because, like we went up twice, and then everything started to be focused much more centrally within Philadelphia, and part of feeling that commitment is going up and feeling part, for me anyway, feeling, part of the energy, and so as that diminished, I think the reality of the peace camp really diminished for me, as it was set up in Seneca.
And then the base closed. And and then you have to ask yourself, okay, now
what?
Is this a peace camp any longer? And what role does it play when it's no longer, when its fundamental mission is not possible any longer?
And I guess, and this is something that I, when our group started to get smaller and smaller too, I began to ask myself, well, are we now just really functioning as a small friendship network, or are we really, creating action and change? And, do we exist because we don't want to part and have to move on? And, so I guess as I was hearing that there was a lot of attrition of people out of Seneca, I asked the same question, because it's sort of hard to, when something's been a big part of your life, to move on.
Very true.
And there was enough women's land by then that there were, it seemed to me, a small group of women who had been very damaged by the experiences that they had in the patriarchy, who were kind of using the women's land as a kind of sanctuary. And while that seems like a perfectly legitimate use for land, it seemed pretty different to me in some ways than the public mission of the peace camp, and that it needed different kinds of skills, and I felt like my commitment to support it was different. And that if I was going to be doing that kind of work with people, there were plenty of people in my own life I could be doing that with. And I guess that was also a sort of a census of, it's like, well, I don't get to just kind of up and go live on women's land, even though that would be lovely. And
Maybe.
right, yes.
Maybe, yes.
One of I mentioned something before. I was at the Nevada test site for some of their actions there, and there was a woman there who was deeply committed to simple living, and she would always talk about living in voluntary simplicity, and I had a lot of reactions to that, and I finally, as respectfully as I knew how to say, I said, well, it's good. I'm glad you can live in voluntary simplicity. I said, I live in involuntary complexity.
I didn't hear that one.
And we understood each other then. And it was fine, but that was very, it made something very clear to me.
Yeah.
And that there was a way in which, I had not made the choice to go live on women's land, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to support necessarily out of the sweat of my brow, how little I got paid working at the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, for somebody to be able to stay on women's land and have more of a claim on my financial resources than other women who were closer to me and equally needy.
Yeah, I mean, living in a city too. I mean, there were housing issues. I mean, there were so many. I had worked with domestic violence, and it was like, so a piece of me was also very attached to the urban experience, and it is confusing. Where does your energy go? And in a way, we say everything's connected and it's wonderful, but in a way it's very confusing too, because it was hard for me to just stick to sort of a solo vision when everything did seem so connected.
Yeah.
No, we never really were. And I would also say that I think the longer we were together, in a sense, the more ingrown we became and the harder it was for new people to come into the group. Because we really had a culture that was our own culture. But it was something that we talked about a lot. And, even from, one of the issues is that when you really have a largely white group and you reach out, and then maybe we would get a few token women of color, but it would be really different if a group had kind of come out of a women of color's movement, and do you recruit just to say that you have a few women of color in the group if that isn't sort of the way the group has crystallized? But it always... We certainly did stuff in coalition with groups that were racially mixed. And I think that there's something to be said for if you're hitting on the right targets and you're doing it effectively and in a way that is not in and of itself playing into racism or classism or anything else, that you're doing a good thing. And that... I've had lots of women of color tell me that, and at some level that's true. I mean, it's not true if your life is entirely circumscribed by race, but I personally don't hold myself to a standard that says that absolutely everything that I must do is, by the formula. I mean, it's important to me that my life be rounded in lots of different ways, and race is one of those ways. But if I'm doing something with a group of Jewish women, I'm not gonna oh God, there are no African American women here. I mean, that's
I think that the work that we were doing at the peace camp was the kind of work that benefited women of all races. And I won't say that we always did it in a way that wasn't in and of itself racist, but we certainly did try.
We thought about it a lot.
And I think that's a good thing. That, sometimes you use your privilege to do things that people who don't have privilege can't do. As long as you're doing the right thing.
But it would have made it hard for me to immerse myself in a movement that did seem like it was, majority white women. Being involved in things in the city with different issues was something that I did value, because I also, I totally agree with Z. I think in and of itself this was really wonderful work, but I also wanted other experiences, and I wanted to be part of movements that did have a lot more diversity, that where I could join, where the issues were sort of present in the city.
You want to leave us with a song?
We're shameless hussies and we don't give a damn. We're loud and raucous and we're fighting for our rights and our sex and our sex and our sex. Men call us names to be nasty and rude like lesbian. Men, hey, you're a witch and prostitute. What a laugh, because all of it is true. The patriarchal image of our sex must die. Through centuries of struggle, we are screaming into action. We're shameless hussies and we don't give a damn. We're loud and raucous and we're fighting for our rights and our sex and our need to be free.
And cut.